It's Rachel here over at Wood Lake Nature Center. In keeping with our bee theme for this week, we're actually going to be talking about native bees. Now, how many native bees do you think that there are here in Minnesota? It's more than 10. More than 50. There's about 400 different species of bee here in Minnesota. That does include the not native bees that you saw on Monday with Scott, the European honeybee. Those were actually brought over from Europe to use in our agricultural system, and they're still a very, very important part of our agriculture system. They're kind of like cows. People use them as part of agriculture. Other bees, the other 399 types of bees that we have here in Minnesota, are bumblebees, carpenter bees, mason bees, sweat bees. There are so many different types of bees, and all of those bees are really beneficial for all the different flowers that you see, making sure that the trees get pollinated. Bet you didn't know that trees get pollinated. They do actually have flowers, and they need to be pollinated as well in order to get those seeds that we see everywhere in the fall, throughout the spring. Very important. They also help spread all of the pollen and seeds for all of our native flowers, or if you just like flowers in general. Probably is going to be a native bee that is going to be pollinating your flower. Now, these bees are active from mid-April to about mid-October. They fly around and they go and they pollinate. That's their job. Now, a lot of these bees, unlike what we normally think of for bees, they don't live in a colony. Bumblebees will live in a colony. They have a queen bee, and that queen bee overwinters, and she will stay alive and sleep and do whatever she needs to do, and then in the spring she'll go find a new nest, which means that she finds a nice little spot in the ground and she burrows into it, makes a nice little tunnel, lays her eggs, and then she has a bumblebee colony, which is really cool. But most bees are actually somewhat solitary, which means that every bee is her own queen. They'll go out and they will mate with other male bees, but they will raise their eggs on their own and continue to just make more bees on their own, and they'll go off, and then once they've grown up, they will fly off and do the same thing. But they don't live with other female bees or anything like that. They generally will stay on their own. About 70% of the bees that we have here in Minnesota are actually ground nesters, which means that they find a nice little spot on the ground and they burrow down into it. It's not something that you really need to worry about, though. As most people, when they think about bees, they think, that's going to sting me. They're really not. Most bees, most native bees especially, actually won't sting you. You could pick it up and just hold it in your hand really nicely and it probably won't sting you. Not saying that you should do that. Just observe them from a nice, safe distance. But unless you're trying to smush them, they're probably not going to sting you. And if they did, they actually don't cause as big of a reaction as say bumblebees or honeybees. It feels more like a pinprick or maybe even a little tickle. Because these bees range in size from a tiny, tiny little grain of rice all the way up to a bumblebee, which I'm sure you all have a general idea of what a bumblebee looks like. They're pretty big. They're generally our biggest bee that we have here in Minnesota. Most people, when they get stung, they actually are being stung by hornets or wasps or yellow jackets, and it's not fun. I understand. I've been stung plenty of times, but they are not bees. They're a different species, so don't blame it on the bees. They're doing what they need to. They're really beneficial. Now, I told you guys that 70% are ground nesters. The 30% that is left is actually our cavity nesters. So when you see those native bee boxes in home improvement stores or the grocery store or wherever, and we'll show you one that we have here at Wood Lake Nature Center. Those ones are for those 30%. They find a nice little cavity, they burrow in, they lay their eggs, and then depending on the type of bee, you can figure out what, depending on the type of bee, they will use different types of material to actually make their nest. Some will use mud, some will use plants, some will use petals or leaf bits or maybe cottonwood seeds. It all depends. Another really cool thing about our native bees, we've been talking a lot of, I'm sure you've heard a lot about different bumblebees. Bumblebees, there are about 20 different species of bumblebee here in Minnesota, including our state bee, the rusty patch bumblebee. Now, this little dude has been found here at Wood Lake, confirmed in our prairie, which is super exciting because this bee is super endangered. So you can all do your part and plant those native flowers or plant just a variety of flowers for them to feed on, and they might be able to get their numbers back up. But it all depends on everybody planting the right kinds of flowers, which we'll link to you. So let's go check out that nest and the bees that I've caught for us today. All right, so the first bee that we're going to be looking at today is one of our bumblebees. This particular bumblebee is a two-spotted bumblebee. I was lucky enough to have a guide in order to be able to look up what this bee was. Bees in general are pretty difficult to identify just based on how the size that they have. Bumblebees are a little easier to identify because of their size. A lot of bees actually need to be identified using microscopes. So this bee is actually trying to get some pollen out of the flower that I put in there with her. Most bees are female. If you look really closely on her legs, you can see buildup of pollen. She will bring that back to eat and to spread throughout different flowers. If you look really closely, she actually has 4 wings, which is one way that you can tell that it is a bee, other than the yellow and black, because a lot of bees are actually different colors, but this particular one is yellow and black. She's really fuzzy, and based on her size, she's not a queen bee, but she's still doing her job and getting all the nectar that she possibly can. Now, if this was a rusty patch bumblebee, there would be more yellow on her abdomen. All insects, like we talked about with the dragonflies and damselflies, have 3 parts to them: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The rusty patch bumblebee has more yellow on their abdomen and actually ends up having, kind of looks like a little brown belt, which is where they get the name rusty patch, because it looks like they have a little bit of rust on their butt, which is always really fun. So this particular bee, it looks very similar to the European honeybee. She does move around a lot, so you might not see her completely. But this particular one, it's called a sweat bee. They're called sweat bees because they are attracted actually to this perspiration on animals and on people, and they actually drink it. It's how they get some of their salt, which is pretty cool. She's been in there for a little bit, so she's not especially happy about being in a jar. We will release her once we're done filming. This particular bee is native to Minnesota. They're really helpful when it comes to pollinating all of our flowers. They even help out with agriculture as well. Now, this particular bee, I'm not 100% sure on the identification. Like I said earlier, sometimes it takes up to just having a microscope in order to see the actual type of bee that you have here. I'm almost positive that this is a green orchard bee. It does exactly what it sounds like. It goes to orchards and it pollinates those flowers quite a bit. It could also be a type of sweat bee. It could be a male sweat bee, which is actually pretty cool. Sweat bees, unlike the one that we just saw, can come in different colors. A lot of people do think that bees are just yellow and black, but they can come in blues or greens. They can look really shiny. So if you see something kind of glinting in the sun on a flower, it might be a metallic sweat bee. So this little dude, one thing that I think that it is a orchard bee rather than a metallic sweat bee is it's carrying pollen not on the underside of its abdomen, but on its legs, which can indicate what type of bee this little dude is. It's pretty cool to see a bee that is actually a different color than what you normally think. Unlike what we've been seeing today, and I actually made this mistake as well, this is a hoverfly. Now the reason why I know that this little dude is a hoverfly is because he has 2 wings rather than 4, which is a really big indicator that it is not a bee. However, it does look very similar to a bee. You can see that its abdomen is striped, and it looks like it might have some sort of stinger on it. And it's been pollinating flowers. So they do actually pollinate some flowers, but they are not bees. So as you can see, it can be really difficult to identify the different types of bees, as well as be mistaken with a fly of some sort as well. There are also flies that mimic the look of bumblebees, which makes it really difficult when you're trying to identify different bumblebees. Alright, so here's an example of one of our native bee nests that we have here at Wood Lake. There's a lot of different types of native bee nests. Bree, when she was showing you how to plant native plants in your yard, showed you one type of bee nest that you oftentimes can find at a home improvement store. This one is a little bit easier, but you can also find some of the assembly needed ingredients, I suppose. Supplies is another word for it, at a home improvement store. Now, this is filled with a bunch of bamboo reeds, and we have drilled holes all the way through, or not quite all the way through, to a stop. So that way a bee, different types of bees, including the sweat bee that we saw earlier, the metallic sweat bees, carpenter bees, mason bees, they will be able to go into the hole here, and they'll lay their eggs all the way back here, and then they'll start putting some food available and making sure that there is enough food for their eggs when they hatch into their larva form, eventually until they can come out the next spring as an adult. They will overwinter their eggs, so it's very important when you put a nest out. If it's open like this, there's probably not any eggs in there. However, if there's there's ants all over this one. If there's a stop like this that's covering it, that means that there's probably eggs in there. Now, it's really easy to replace all of these different tubes every year or so. If they've been used, you just want to replace the ones that have been used, and make sure that there's actually a little hole so that those eggs have actually emerged. As you can see, there's different sizes of tubes, as well as we drilled a hole in different lengths in order to help different types of bees. And we'll put up a guide for what to do for different types of bees in the description below. It's pretty cool, huh?
Hi, Naturalist Scott here for this week's installment of Creature Feature Storytime. Now, you've been learning about pollinators, and we have a pollinator peace garden right here at Wood Lake. You can come and look at the flowers and see all the different types of pollinators, maybe butterflies, bees, many different insect species. Or you can walk behind the building through our prairie and even tour our large prairie at the south end of the park. Today's story time, we're going to read Beekeepers by Linda Oatman High. The springtime sunshine pours like warm honey from the sky as Grandpa and I stand on the back porch before our morning chores. We dress long-sleeved white coveralls, boots, gloves, and straw hats with veils of mesh. We walk across the grass, dew misting our boots, past the barn, the pond, the trees, and into the bee yard. The wooden hives are stacked high, fronts facing the sun, backs to the barn with a brick on each hive. "Good morning, honeybees," Grandpa calls into the quietness, his eyes sparkling behind the net. I look up and see pods of pollen, purple and pink, yellow and orange, blue, red, and green, gathered from springtime flowers and trees, clinging to some of the bees. "Every color of the rainbow," says Grandpa. "The pollen gatherers have been working hard, and now it's our turn." I lift off bricks and pry off the top covers with my hive tool, as Grandpa gives the bees a puff of smoke from his bee smoker to quiet them and keep them from flying. "Remember September?" Grandpa asks. "All the bricks standing on end?" "And July," I chime. He nods and I smile, thinking of honey harvest times. I close my eyes, seeing the clear honey in the combs capped with snow-white wax. I take a deep breath, remembering the sweet smell of spun honey. "Best open your eyes," Grandpa whispered. "There's a swarm starting." My eyes fly open and I catch my breath, scared. The sky darkens and buzzing fills my ears, making my head spin. Grandpa chuckles softly, eyes to the sky. "Beautiful," he whispers. The hum of the bees' wings grows louder and louder, and my heart races with the sound. Standing still, I hardly dare to breathe as the bees twirl down like a tornado, swirling and whirling every which way above Grandpa and me, then clustering on the branch of a tree. Goosebumps sting my arms, and I shake, wishing the swarm would settle. Grinning, Grandpa grabs his swarm gathering tool, a long pole with a hook on the end, and an empty hive to place beneath the swarm. He hands me the pole. "Dislodge the swarm," he says. My heart flies into my throat. Bringing down the bees has always been Grandpa's job. "What if they don't come?" I ask, trembling. Grandpa smiles. "They'll come," he says. I take a deep breath, then hoist the pole into the cloud of bees. Slowly, I pull down the branch, shake it, and a mass of bees plops down. Then the swarm swirls around, and soon thousands of bees are facing the hives, heads bowed down and tails held high. I sneak a glance at Grandpa and grin as the bees zoom into the hives. Grandpa reaches over and takes the pole, propping it against the fence. "Their new home," he says, as we watch the bees. "They're settled, so the queen must be safe and sound in the hive." We leave the bee yard, walking past the trees, the pond, the barn. "A swarm in May is worth a load of hay," says Grandpa as we walk. "A swarm in June is worth a silver spoon," I say. "A swarm in July isn't worth a fly," we say together, laughing. Grandpa lifts off his bee veil. "Why do bees swarm?" I ask, taking off my veil and gloves. Grandpa shrugs. "Why do spiders spin?" he asks. We look at each other and smile. "You're a fine keeper of bees," Grandpa says. "First honey chunk of the season is all yours." I nod, proud, as we walk up the porch steps and into the house. Springtime sunshine like warm honey across our backs. The end. So come to Wood Lake in September and you'll still see bees flying around and collecting nectar and pollen. September is the time when we do our honey harvest. So watch for that in our program lists on the weekends. And have a great summer. And remember, bees are our friends.